Luke is writing his gospel to explain the salvation that Jesus offered. Now, this is, as we said in the previous session, this is part one of almost a two-volume work. Acts being the second part, Luke the first part. In the book of Luke, it says that he's writing these down in 1 verse 1. He's writing down an account of things that have been accomplished, right? Things that Jesus has done. And in Acts 1 verse 1, he says in my previous work, referring to the Gospel of Luke, he says that he wrote about what Jesus began to do and teach. And so with that, it's pretty simple. The Gospels of Luke and the others are basically telling us what Jesus did and what Jesus said. And like I've said already in our previous session, we're meant to witness these, observe and interpret them, but then put ourselves in the story and say, because Jesus did this and said that, what do I believe about him? And so they're evangelistic. They're inviting us to make a response. And so we'll jump right into it, and in this session we'll look through the birth narrative of the book of Luke. Now, only Luke and Matthew include the birth narrative of Jesus. Mark and John, they do not. And so we will be comparing Luke's account to Matthew's account on a few moments where it differs, and that difference is important. And so what Luke does here is he does kind of an interchange that we've talked about, one of these laws of composition where he goes back and forth between an idea. And so in Luke, chapters 1 to 2, he goes back and forth between Jesus and John. He opens with the prophecy about John's birth, and then we have the prophecy about Jesus' birth, right? The foretelling of each of those births. And then we have the actual birth of John. And then following the birth of John, we have the birth of Jesus. And so he's showing how these two characters are similar, but there's little differences along the way. And so within the chapter 1, Luke records the prophecy of John's birth and then the prophecy of Jesus' birth. Now, he actually puts them in parallel to one another. In the prophecy about John, the main character is Zechariah, John's father. And in the prophecy about Jesus' birth, the main character is Mary, Jesus' mother. And so as he tells both prophecies in a very similar way, it's meant to draw a response or an emphasized point that we'll get to as we go through it. So let's start with John's the foretelling of John's birth. It opens with a time statement in the days of Herod, Luke 1, verse 5. And it tells us the place. It's in the days of Herod, king of Judea. And so that kind of puts it on the time. And this is Herod the Great that we've talked about, the one sent to liberate the Jewish people, given the title of Herod, king of the Jews. That's this Herod. He's the one in control. He's the king. He's the force over God's people, similar to the Pharaoh in the book of Egypt, in the book of Exodus, telling the story of the rescue out of Egypt. And then it jumps into a description of Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth. And notice in 1 verse 6, it says that they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. Now, these are terms that are used for righteous people in the Old Testament, right? Walking blamelessly. And so that's said of people like Noah, it's said of Abraham, it's said of Job. And so these are righteous people. These are the people you expect God to use and expect God to move in and be with. However, there's an important contrast in verse 7. It says, but they were barren. So this is a problem. These are righteous people, followers of God, walking blamelessly, doing everything they can to serve God, but they're barren. It was a disgrace to be barren. It wasn't a good thing. But what Luke is doing here is he's drawing a direct parallel between Zechariah and Elizabeth to Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was a righteous man, but his wife was also barren. But God does an incredible miracle to have her have a son, and that's the beginning of God's movement of bringing about a blessing to the nations. And so Luke does the same thing here. We're meant to think about Abraham and Sarah when we read Zechariah and Elizabeth, that God is doing something new, an incredible movement breaking in, just like in Genesis 12. It's also comparable to Israel's state, right? They're God's people, yet they're enslaved. This is kind of a contradiction, right? God's people should be free, should be liberated. Righteous people in their minds that should not be barren. And so Zechariah and Elizabeth, they're similar to Israel, right? They're God's people, but they're stuck in this predicament. And so then Zechariah goes into the temple. He was a priest on duty, and it was his job, and because there were so many priests, they were kind of chosen by lot to have a special time where it was their opportunity to go in and light the incense, which was right before the Holy of Holies. And so Zechariah goes in to do that, and while he's in there, he has a vision from the Lord. Now, he was supposed to go in and come out very quickly, which makes the people wonder later on that why is he delaying? He's not supposed to be in there that long. It's very holy and kind of dangerous to stay there too long. But he stays there because he has this incredible vision where the angel shows up. The angel of the Lord is standing next to the altar and tells Zechariah that he's going to have a son, and that his prayers have been heard, and Elizabeth will bear a son, and his son's name will be John. And then it goes into a description of what John will do, right? He'll be great before the Lord, and his job in verse 17 is he will go before him in spirit and power of Elijah, and turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. So John is going to prepare the way for the Lord, and he's going to prepare the people for the Lord, so the people are ready for when God comes back. John is preparing people for the end of the exile when God returns and becomes king. It's very clear that we're meant to connect this to the passage we read in our session on the narrative link between Jeremiah and Luke, the passage in Malachi 3 verse 1. It says, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple." And so John is this prophesied messenger who's preparing the way for the Lord to return to his temple. And so right in the beginning there, we have this hint because Zechariah and Elizabeth are kind of like Abraham and Sarah, who God did an incredible move of, in his plan of restoration. It begins with Abraham and Sarah, and now it's kind of beginning again with Zechariah and Elizabeth. But then notice something that you don't expect in the story, right? This is a old priest, a righteous man. You should expect him to respond with faith. But notice how he responds. In verse 18, he says, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." Right? She's too old to have a child, and she's been barren for her whole life. There's no way now, when it's impossible for her to have a child, that she could have one. And then Zechariah, because of his doubt, the response of the angel is he judges him. Okay? And he's actually he's judged to be silent because, notice the connection in verse 20, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time. And so Zechariah is judged and said that he'll be speechless until the birth of his son John. Now, if we take that narrative and compare it to the narrative of Mary and the prophecy she receives, we notice an important contrast. And when you're observing parallel stories, you always want to look for the slight difference in them or the conclusion. Normally, when it's a parallel story, the end of both stories is meant to be the main point or the emphasis the author is trying to communicate. And so Mary's story, it begins the same way, right? Zechariah's story started with a date, a time, and a setting. The same happens with Mary's, right? It says, "In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth." Okay? And so the initial one, Zechariah's vision, was in the temple in Jerusalem, where you expect God's plan to break in, right? that's where all of the religious leaders were. That was the center of power and authority, the right moment for God to make clear his plans. But now the story shifts, the setting shifts, and you're up in the hillside of the region of Galilee in this small kind of nowhere town in Nazareth. And that should be shocking. What will God have to say to someone living in Nazareth? And then there's also a little kind of vision that Mary receives, okay? The opening word is, "Greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you," in verse 28. But there's a contrast there, similar to the but barren contrast of Zechariah's vision. Mary says, but she was greatly troubled at this saying, and trying to figure out what it means. Why would this angel be calling her favored one, the Lord is with you? She is a young teenage girl, not holding any rank in society or power or authority. Why would God use that phrase for her? It's very different than God referring to a priest, an old priest, as righteous and blameless. That would make sense. Everyone would agree. But when God refers to Mary as my favored one, it's strange. And again, you see Zechariah and Elizabeth, they're favored, but they're barren. That's kind of ironic. Whereas Mary is young and doesn't give her those descriptions of righteous and blameless, but she is favored. God is with her. Incredible. And then Mary is obviously meant to be contrasted to Zechariah, as we see right here. As I've been saying, Mary is this young teenage girl, where Zechariah is an old priest. You should expect him to receive such an announcement. You should not expect Mary to receive such an announcement. Then Mary's announcement comes, and it's very similar as Zechariah's. It's about her son, about his name and what he will do. His name will be Jesus, just like John the Baptist. He will also be great, it says, but his ministry is different. John's ministry is to prepare the way for the Lord to come and to prepare the people. Jesus' ministry is that in verse 32, it says, he will be called the Son of the Most High. This is the name for a king in the Old Testament. And it's confirmed when it says, and the Lord will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. Now this is the prophecies that we looked briefly at in Jeremiah, where it talks about a seed of David or a branch of Jesse coming and ruling God's people forever. And that's now Jesus. So John prepares the way for God, and Jesus is the Davidic king that will bring about God's rule and reign. Now, that's no contrast there. It makes sense. That's John's role. That's Jesus' role. But the big contrast comes in Mary's response. Okay? Mary says to the angel a similar question. Zechariah said, how shall I know this, in verse 18, and then gives a reason why it's impossible. Okay, I'm old and my wife is old. Whereas Mary, she asks a similar question, how will this be? And then kind of her reason is, because I'm a virgin, like this is impossible as well. But, so it seems to be the same question, right? But notice Zechariah is judged for his question, meaning it's probably not a good question and it shows his doubt and unbelief, whereas Mary is not judged. She's given an answer. It says in verse 35, the angel said to her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And so she's not judged. And some commentators would say that her question seems to be a request for information, not for proof, whereas Zechariah perhaps was asking for proof. And so, again, this is a remarkable contrast. Zechariah, righteous, blameless priest in the temple, serving the Lord, disbelieves the promises of God. Whereas Mary, young teenage girl in a small, impoverished town in the hills of Galilee, in Nazareth, hears this incredible prophecy and believes it and says, yes. Okay, we'll come back to that because that's the emphasized part of these two accounts. But let's go a little bit deeper. Zechariah doesn't believe the prophecy of his son in a similar way that Israel in the Old Testament didn't really believe the prophets. And as a result, there was this 400 period of silent years that we talked about in a couple sessions earlier, right? And because they didn't believe, they're silent until God breaks in. Just as though Zechariah is silent until the birth of his son. Now Mary, she responds to Israel's kind of current position. They have the opportunity, like Mary, to respond in faith to God's new inbreaking. Will they be God's servant and recognize what's happening? And we're meant to see this idea because in Mary's response in verse 38 is, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." The servant of the Lord, that was Israel's position. And now Mary is saying that she'll trust the Lord even though this seems ridiculous and crazy. I will be your servant. And she displays the faith that on the one hand, Israel should have as God returns to his people in and through his son. On the other hand, Luke puts us right at the beginning of his gospel to kind of invite his readers into the same journey. Will we respond like Zechariah to the incredible narrative and say, well, that doesn't seem very believable? Or will we respond like Mary and say, that's unbelievable, but I'm in and I agree, and whatever you want to do, I'm your servant, I'm listening. And this is a contrast that Luke starts off right in chapter 1, but you see it again and again and again throughout the whole narrative. It's in a sense the ones that we think are in the kingdom of God, the righteous old priest you'd think would be in, he kind of misses it and doesn't see it. Whereas Mary, who we don't think should be in, she's a young teenage woman, no place in society, she is actually in the kingdom of God because she recognizes and has faith. And so continue to observe this. Who rejects Jesus' message and who responds to Jesus' message? Massive theme in the book of Luke that he leads us into right in the opening narratives. Then the remaining kind of three chapters the remainder of chapter 1 and chapter 2 and 3, Luke structures the birth narrative around these three songs. We have the song that Mary sings when she meets Elizabeth. We have the song that Zechariah sings after he is able to speak. And then we have the song of Simon when Jesus shows up to the temple for his dedication in chapter 3. And so we're going to take a look at each one of these because they all have important themes that become center themes for the book of Luke. So Mary's song in chapters 1, 46 to 55, that's also mirrored or comparable to Zechariah's song in 2:68 to 79. Now, they both begin with thanksgiving, right? Mary's in verse 46 says, "My soul magnifies the Lord, my spirit rejoices in God my Savior." Whereas Zechariah begins his song with, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel." And then after the thanksgiving, there's the connector for, right? Shows the reason. Why are they singing their songs? Why are they rejoicing? Okay? Now, the immediate context is because Mary is welcomed by Elizabeth. She's finally welcomed by someone, whereas probably everyone else was rejecting her and accusing her of all kinds of things, whereas she's accepted, and the word of the Lord to her is confirmed because Elizabeth also has a son. So she rejoices. Whereas Zechariah, he's rejoicing because he's able to speak again. He faithfully named his son John, and the Lord releases his tongue. So that's why they're rejoicing. But then the wider context is they're rejoicing about what God is doing at that moment in his people. Okay? And what God is doing is very similar between both of the songs. Mary says the reason she's rejoicing is because he looked on the humble estate of his servant. Again, that word servant is, in this sense, it's Mary, but in the wider sense, that's Israel. And God has now looked on his servant, his humble servant, his pushed down, persecuted servant. And notice what he's going to do to his servant. It says in verse 54, he has helped his servant. But what has he done? Mary lays it out from verses 51 to 53. Okay, and you can Observe this almost as a list. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. Incredible contrast. The ones that have power, their power is removed. And those that are powerless, they are given power. Now, in a sense, this is what the nation of Israel is expecting, because the one who has power is Rome. It's Herod. It's people that oppress them. But now the belief is God is turning that over, and it will be the poor. It will be the humble. It will be his crushed people that then are saved. A key word in this chapter is the word mercy. It's a good observation to observe all the times it's used in chapters 1, because it's why God is moving. It's his mercy that brings about this present move to rescue his people. And so, to conclude, Mary, she becomes an example of what God will do to his servant, or what God will do to those who recognize his plan of salvation. They will be raised up. They will be exalted. Now, in Zechariah's song, again, after he sings the song after John, after he names his son John, starts with thanksgiving. And the reason he is giving thanks, the wider context, is verse 68. Observe these two key words. For he has visited and redeemed his people. Okay? That word visited, it also comes from Exodus 4:31. The people are worshiping because God has visited his people. He's come to them in their slavery, in their bondage to Pharaoh, and he's coming, why? To redeem them, which is the next word, also coming from Exodus 6, verse 6, as we looked at in our study. Redeeming is where you purchase someone from their slavery. There's an exchange of masters. So God is, in the minds of the people, they're rejoicing because God is going to redeem them from being controlled by Rome and by Herod, and now God will be their king once again, just as the Exodus. He continues there in verse 69, and raise up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. This is again those prophecies of the Old Testament that God will have a son of David to sit on the throne. And the second Exodus will be led by this messianic figure who will be their king. And so Zechariah concludes his song by repeating the job of John, what John will do to prepare the way and to have the people ready. And the reason he's to prepare the people is in verse 78. The connector there is because. Because the tender mercy of our God, whereby the sunrise shall visit us from on high, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace. And so he's saying that John's preparing the way because God is coming. There's sun rising in this dark moment. Again, we're to think back to Genesis chapter 1, where God brings light and creates a new world out of the darkness. They're just coming out of these 400 years of turmoil, these silent years of chaos, but now the sun is rising on them. And the phrase, those who sit in darkness in the shadow of death, that's a quotation from Isaiah chapter 9, and it's referring to the people that are crushed by the exile, the people that are crushed by the powers of the world. God is now coming to them in this moment. He's coming to bring peace, right? Peace is a way of describing this perfect wholeness from the Garden of Eden. God's going to bring about that restoration. John is going to prepare the way for that to happen. That's why that's the summary of Zechariah's song. Now, to summarize both of them, basically they're showing how dark the setting is and this longing desire for God to come in and visit his people and bring about the second Exodus. Now, after that, we have Jesus' actual birth. He's born in Bethlehem because of the taxation, or he has to be registered because of taxation declared by Caesar, which we looked at in our historical setting. That's an emphasis of the persecution and of the oppression that Mary and Zechariah are singing that they will be delivered from. Very interesting, you know who shows up to Jesus' birth in the book of Luke. It's the shepherds. These, again, are outcast people. They're on the outside of society. They're not respected. What are they doing there? Similar to, why is God saying this stuff to Mary in Nazareth? These are, again, a repetition of that incredible contrast. And compare that to who shows up in the birth narrative of Jesus in Matthew. It's very, very different. Then we come to the third and final hymn as Jesus is being dedicated in the temple. A man named Simon comes and sings, and he's rejoicing as well. And the reason for his rejoicing is very similar to Mary's and Zechariah's. This is now in Luke chapter 2, verses 29 to 32. Simon, or Simeon, is rejoicing because, he says in verse 30, "For my eyes have seen your salvation," your rescue, your plan of breaking in. He's seen that because he's seen Jesus, whose name means salvation. And then he says, "That you have prepared in the presence of all people a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel." And so Luke includes this narrative because it's the theme of his gospel. Jesus is coming and he'll be a light to the Gentiles, those on the outside, and he'll be glory and a light for the people on the inside, the Israelite people. And so in this, it warms us up. And this is then, the gospel is going to jump ahead and through Jesus' whole growing up years until his beginning of ministry. But the birth narratives prepare us for what Jesus will do when he embarks on his ministry. He's going to be this one that embodies God's return to the temple. As the Messiah, he's going to bring about the kingdom. Everyone's been waiting for this to happen, and now it seems that it's finally happening. But the question in Luke is, will you be able to recognize it, or will you not, because it doesn't fit what the original hearers of Jesus' message thought would be the kingdom?